Hi everyone, thanks for coming to Codys. We have a couple of winners in the crowd. People who've been here since 6:15. Let's give them a round of applause. That's amazing. One quick bit of housekeeping: if you would shut off a cell phone or a beeper or any kind of watch that's going to make a noise, or put it on vibrate, that would be great. Thank you. I'm going to be quick because I know there's already been people here for 45 minutes, so we'll just get right on with it. As you know, the speaker tonight is George Lakoff. The book, The Political Mind, Why You Can't Understand 21st Century American Politics with an 18th Century Brain. As people probably know, he's written many other books. He is the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Distinguished Professor of Cognitive Science and Linguistics at UC Berkeley, our wonderful school right up here, and Senior Fellow at the Rockridge Institute, a think tank in Berkeley. He's a resident of Berkeley. Please welcome George Lakoff.
Can you all hear me? Is this okay? And thank you all for coming. It's great to see friends and neighbors. Wonderful. Hi, Dorothy. I want to tell you a little bit about this book and why it's a little bit different from the other books on politics that I've done. What I do over at the university is cognitive science and linguistics. That's my business. And the other books have all been based on the cognitive science and linguistics without telling you that. That is, it just, act as though, it just came out of the blue somehow. But it turns out to be important to actually know how the mind works. And in the last 30 years or so, an enormous number of new findings have come out of neuroscience and cognitive science and cognitive linguistics that are really quite extraordinary. And they really change our understanding of the mind and of reason in such a deep way that I thought it was important to actually tell people about it, because almost nobody knows. What you wind up getting is snippets, an occasional TV show on this. Can you hear? Yeah. If you can't hear, go like this. All right. We need a little bit louder. Do we have a sound person? Let's try it again. Check. How's that? Better? Better? Great. Thank you very much. Good. So let me try to give you a sense of why all this stuff is important for politics. This country was founded on Enlightenment principles like freedom, equality, democracy, and so on, political principles, and a theory of mind that was called universal reason. And the idea there was this, that it's reason that makes us human beings, and that if we all can reason equally well, then there's no reason why somebody else should govern us. We don't need kings and popes and so on to tell us what to do. We should be able to govern ourselves. That was the idea, marvelous idea, behind the Enlightenment. Really important. Along with that came a particular view of reason, and one that has become part of popular culture since then. And that view of reason goes like this, and I was raised with it. I suspect most of you have been too. Enlightenment reason says that reason is conscious. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. I'm conscious. It says that reason is abstract as opposed to being physical. It says that reason is unemotional, dispassionate, that emotion gets in the way of reason. It says that reason can fit the world as it is, directly, and that it's logical, and therefore you can just be told the facts and reason to the right conclusion. It assumes that the purpose of reason is self-interest. That is, what reason does, and the reason we evolved with it, is to be able to fulfill our interests. And it assumes, as I said, that everybody has the same reason. We all reason the same way. What we found out in neuroscience and cognitive science over the past 30 years is that every one of those is false. Every single one. And it turns out that each of them actually matters for our political life. Now, that may not be obvious, but let me try to go through first a little bit of the science, and then as we go through it, tell you a bit about why it matters for our political life, and just how deeply that view of reason is embedded in the way politics is done, and the way the media is set up, and so on. So, first, consciousness. It turns out that about 98% of our reason is unconscious. You can't actually quantify it in that way, but it's a ballpark figure. And I can tell you why I reached the same conclusion that the various neuroscientists have. But it's basically what your brain is doing when you're busy being conscious. Now, what about the disembodied part? The reason is abstract. Not true. You think with your brain. Now, sometimes you might wonder if certain political leaders think with some other parts of their brain. But even they think with their brains. And why does that matter? Well, it turns out brains are made up of neurons and neural connections, 100 billion of them, 100 trillion connections. That's a lot of stuff going on up there, but it's not a general purpose reasoning device. It turns out that the brain is set up to run your body. And you are reasoning with this instrument that is biological and is set up to run a body. And that turns out to matter in all sorts of ways that we will see as we go on. So the actual functioning of your body is going to get into reason in very deep and important ways. But also, you can't just reason about anything at all. You can only reason about what your body allows you to reason about, and you can only understand things and perceive things in the world that your body allows you to understand and perceive. So you do not directly fit the world as it is. Now, what about the idea of dispassionate reason? So you might believe, for example, suppose you had a stroke or you had a brain injury that didn't allow you to feel any emotion. There are such brain injuries. There's a magnificent book written about this by Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error. And what you might think, if you had such an injury, you would be sort of like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. You'd be super rational, that no emotions would get in your way. It's the opposite. Turns out you can't be rational without emotion. And let me tell you why. Actually, you can see it very easily. Suppose that you had such a brain injury. Suppose that you could feel no emotion at all, and you could not tell any emotion in anybody else. How would you know what to want? Think about it. How would you know what to want? It's remarkable. You wouldn't know whether to like it, you'd like it or not, because like and not like wouldn't make any sense. You wouldn't know whether other people would love you or hate you or whatever they would feel towards you, because you couldn't tell. So basically, you would not be able to decide much. And that's what happens when you actually have such a brain injury. You screw up your life, you have no idea what to do, you kind of do random things, and you can't be rational at all. Reason requires emotion. Now, what is it about the way the brain is set up that leads to this result? And it's a deep fact. We have two major neural pathways for emotions. A positive one with the neurotransmitter dopamine, a negative one with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. The positive pathway goes past those parts of the brain which, when activated, make you feel happy, satisfied, get a sense of awe. The other, norepinephrine pathway, which goes past those parts of the brain that, when activated, make you feel anxious, fearful, angry. Okay? And those parts of the brain, those pathways, are connected to lots of other places in the brain. They go along pathways. The pathways have been traced out. There's a new paper. In fact, I visited Tony Damasio and his wife a couple of months ago, and they had just traced out a whole bunch of new pathways from the emotional regions to other more semantically contentful regions. And what they found was this, that there are certain places where these pathways converge, called convergence zones, and at those places, these neural connections from the emotional regions are neurally bound to other neural connections. Neural binding means the following. Let me give you an example. So imagine a red Volkswagen. I used to have a red Volkswagen, a Bug. And if you get an image in your head of a red bug, you don't get an image of just the shape of the Volkswagen and redness. It's one thing. You get an object. But the redness is computed in one part of the brain, the shape in another part of the brain. And what allows them to be a single object is a phenomenon called neural binding. And the best theory of that right now is that when those two parts of the brain are firing synchronously together like this, you experience that as things being the same object. Well, it turns out, and this was called time locking, it turns out that at these convergence zones you have time locking. And the time locking essentially links neural pathways from the emotions to more semantically contentful areas. Now, why does this show up? Why does it matter in your life? Why does it matter in politics? Chapter 1 of the book is about that, and it's based on Anna Nicole Smith. Let me tell you a little about that. I was at a conference a couple of years ago of journalists and scholars, and right after a paper on neuroscience, David Reef, who's one of our great journalists, was there. Anna Nicole Smith had just died. She was everywhere on TV. And he raised his hand and he said to the speaker, who was Drew Weston, you'll never understand politics if you don't understand Anna Nicole Smith. You have to understand cultural narrative to get politics. So I thought that was an interesting suggestion, so I went back to my room, turned on my TV. There was Larry King, Anna Nicole plastered everywhere, lots of callers. And what I did was I just took notes on all the callers. And then I went to other channels and took notes on all those callers. And for the several days after that, I kept doing this. What I found was this. Just about every major cultural narrative and cultural myth in America came up in Anna Nicole Smith's life and was projected onto her by somebody or other. So was she a rags to riches case? Was she a case of a gold digger? Was she a calculating bitch? Was she a somebody who was sort of a blah celebrity just because she was a celebrity? And there are lots and lots of these cultural narratives that we have, and people just projected them all onto her. And she lived them out. I mean, she sort of accepted them and then ran her life in terms of many of these. Now, each of these narratives has both semantic content and emotional content. Take the rags to riches narrative. You have some protagonist who starts out poor and impoverished and can't get anywhere, and just through his own pluck and work, arises in the world. Then there are problems that they encounter and so on. And you read these stories one after another. You start identifying with this person, and then you say, "Oh, it's awful when they have a terrible setback." But then they go further and further, and you hope that they'll get further, and you cheer when they succeed. Okay, this is emotional. The emotions from the emotional pathways are tied to the semantic content seamlessly. And this is true of every hero-villain story. It's true of every narrative you can have. And it shows up in every campaign biography. Right? Rags to riches, there is Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton, pick one. Lots of them, right? Is it the attempt to hit the glass ceiling and almost making it? Is it various other ones? You have the wife who has been betrayed by her husband, and so on. One after another cultural narrative that shows up in our political biographies. And that matters a lot. So what happens is that we not only see this in politics, we live them. We all have our own narratives that we try to fit. That is, we are trying to either climb the ladder of success or find a meaningful life or search for meaning in life, whatever. There are many, many cultural narratives out there that each of us is trying to live, and others that we're all trying to avoid. Things that we don't want to happen to us. And that's very natural. They're extremely emotional, and they're contentful. And that is the reason why you have to be emotional in order to be rational. Because that's how you live your life out, and that's how you understand everybody else living their life out, and that's how you understand our politics. Now, there's another part of this. Remember that each of these narratives is physically in your brain, because you think with your brain, and that's important. Everything you learn is there physically in your brain. Now, when you are born, it turns out between 0 and 5, half of your neural connections die. That's what shapes your brain. The question is, which half? And it's the half least used. That's terrifically important for reasons we'll come back to later. But that's why early childhood education is so very, very important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about frames and framings and about metaphor. Back in 1974, Erving Goffman, who is a great sociologist and a friend, published a book called Frame Analysis. Goffman was the kind of sociologist who did not just sit in his office writing books. He actually got out into the field. And by that you mean he actually worked in the places he studied. So he studied in an insane asylum, he worked in the insane asylum. He studied Las Vegas, he became a croupier for a year. In short, he really understood how institutions work. And what he concluded was the following, that every institution is structured by what he called a frame. For example, take a hospital. You have doctors, you have nurses, you have orderlies, receptionists, patients. Those are called semantic roles. They're the roles people play. And similarly, there are locations. There are operating rooms and reception desks and instruments like scalpels and x-ray machines and so on, all through the hospital. And that's part of the frame. The rest of the frame is what you do in a hospital. So you know that the surgeon operates on the patient in the operating room with the scalpel and so on. And then there are lots of other scenarios that you understand as being in the frame of the hospital. How do you know what the boundaries of this frame are? Well, it turns out the frame can be broken. For example, you go to visit a friend. You go to Alta Bates. You walk into the desk. There's a doctor lying there. They hand you a scalpel, say, "You're operating now." Out of frame. You know the boundaries, and you don't have to get a grant to, from NSF to do an experiment to find that out. Although, you might try. Now, that's the idea of a frame. And what Charles Fillmore, one of our greatest linguists ever, one of my colleagues here at Berkeley, who retired a few years back, in 1975, a year later, published a paper called Frame Semantics, in which he pointed out that every word is defined relative to a frame. Every single one. Like surgeon, like scalpel, like glass, right? A glass is what? It's a container. It's a physical object. It has an interior, an exterior, the object itself. You can put liquids into it, you can drink out of it, like that, and it's about this big. That's about what you know. It's made of certain materials and not others. You don't know anything else. It's a small structure. Its semantic roles are interior, exterior, filler, the liquid that goes into it, and so on. Very simple thing, but if I say he picked up the glass and drank some water from it, that frame will appear. You'll get an image of it like this. Now, one of the things that we do a few blocks away, about 4 from here, over on Center Street, is the International Computer Science Institute. And on the 5th and 6th floors over there, Jerry Feldman and I, for many years, have been running what we call a Neural Theory of Language project. Jerry is the guy who in the 1970s figured out how neural computation works. And what we've been trying to do since 1988 is to figure out how it's possible for these neural structures in the brain, through neural computation, to give rise to thought and language. And we have a pretty good idea of how it works after only 20 years. Now we're not complete by any means. We don't know exactly exactly what circuits are where and stuff like that. But we have an idea of how the computation has to go for frames, for narratives, for other kinds of structures, and for language and for grammar. And it's quite remarkable when you actually look at and learn the details of this, because they show up in our politics, as you will see in a while. We have some idea of the kind of neural structures needed to compute frames. Moreover, every word is itself a neural structure having to do with pronunciation, having to do with the vocal tract and the auditory cortex, and writing and reading and so on. That is, and that, if you utter a word like glass, it will activate a frame, and it will activate a neural circuit. That is, one circuit will activate another. That is natural. Why is that important in politics? Well, as I wrote in the book a couple of years ago, called "Don't Think of an Elephant," if you hear the words something like tax relief, you will understand that taxation is an affliction to be relieved. That there's a reliever who takes it away, who's a kind of hero, and that if anybody tries to stop them, they're a villain. They're a bad guy. Okay? And if you hear over and over, like the first day Bush was in office, Karen Hughes wrote a speech about tax relief, and then the next day was another and another, and every day you heard tax relief, tax relief, tax relief, and the frame got activated over and over. But what happens when neurons get activated over and over? The synapses get stronger and stronger and stronger, and eventually that circuit becomes permanent. It's in your brain. Your tax relief is there. Now, you may inhibit it. You may say, have other circuitry that says, this is bunk. I got to watch out for this one. But it's there. And so much there that even the New York Times uses tax relief on its editorial and front pages recently. Now, and not only that, you get Democrats using it in their tax plans. So what you find is that conservatives have gotten their language out there much more effectively than progressives have, and their language activates their frames, but frames don't come alone. Because circuits in the brain are not isolated, they activate other circuits which activate other ones. It turns out you have systems of frames. And conservative thought and progressive thought come both in systems, complicated systems. Now, if you have language that expresses what's in those systems, then the systems get stronger and stronger, and you can be consciously aware of it through being consciously aware of the language. And that's another thing. Language is something you're consciously aware of. You know when you hear a word or when you pronounce a word. You may not be consciously aware of the content of the frame, but you know about the words. And some people think that the words are the frames. That's a mistake. Now, what about metaphors? It turns out that we think metaphorically, and this was something that other friends and I discovered back in the late 1970s. There's a book we wrote then, and I came out in '80, called Metaphors We Live By. There's a bigger book, like about that big, called Philosophy in the Flesh, that goes about 250 pages of the details of metaphorical thought. Now, and we learned how it worked, we learned how to write them down precisely, how to characterize how they're related to each other, and so on. So we understand a lot about how metaphorical thought works, and language piggybacks on the thought. It's mostly unconscious. What we learned in the '80s was something surprising. We had a seminar over here in which we had people who worked on various languages, especially non-Western languages, and speakers of those languages who were linguists from around the world. About a dozen different language families. And surprisingly, a lot of the metaphors were the same. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Not just the words are different. The images might be slightly different. But the general metaphors, which are basically frames mapped onto other frames, look the same. And we didn't know why. Had no idea why this should occur. but we were able to map them out in detail. It took another dozen years or so before we found out why. That was in 1997. At that point, a young computer scientist named Srini Narayanan over at ICSI did a dissertation in which he, I won't go through the whole content of the dissertation, but what he came up with was a theory of neural computation, the computational structure needed for metaphor and for metaphorical thought. And it was actually pretty simple. He showed exactly what would be needed, how it would work, and then he did a computational model of showing how it worked and how basically what metaphors do is to take the reasoning from one domain of your experience and apply it to another. And he showed that this would work computationally. A remarkable thing, but what came out of it automatically was a theory of metaphor learning. And that theory explained a lot of why we have the metaphors we have. What we found out since then, at the same time when people started investigating when children learn these things, is that by the time you're 6 or 7, you have learned hundreds of metaphors without knowing them, without being the least bit aware of it. And let me try to give you a sense of what they are and then why they're politically important and important for your moral life. But let's start with simple cases. More is up and less is down. Prices rise, the price of gas is going through the roof, etc. It's a metaphor, it's not literally up, but we understand more is up, less is down. And it's not just here, it's around the world. You understand, let's say, that a warm person or a cold person is not physically warm or cold necessarily, but maybe affectionate or unaffectionate. So why is that the case? Why do you understand quantity in terms of verticality? Why do you understand emotionality, affection in terms of warmth? Well, we did figure that out some time back. We saw that it had to do with a correlation in your experience. We pour water in the glass, every single time the level goes up. More water, more verticality. Okay? You have affection. You're held affectionately as a child. You feel warmth when you're held. Now, what happens in your brain when this occurs? Well, suppose you see your mother pouring water into a glass or a formula into the bottle or something as a child every day, over and over. And every time you get more of the liquid going in, the level goes up. Quantity is a part of the brain that registers quantity. There's another part that's not in the same place that registers verticality. They're both active together over and over and over. Similarly, you're held affectionately. You feel affection and warmth in different parts of the brain over and over and over. Okay? What does that do? Well, when that happens, you get what is called spreading activation along existing neural pathways. That is, each neuron is connected to 10,000 others. When you experience quantity or verticality, it's not just one neuron, there's a whole bunch of them that are active, and they all spread out in all directions, and from both centers. So they're spreading out from both centers. Then it happens again, and where it spreads to gets stronger. And as they get stronger, they spread further, and further, and further, until they meet. That is, until the shortest connection is found. When that happens, you get double reinforcement of this circuit, and a circuit is formed that becomes permanent. That circuit is the metaphor. More is up, or affection is warmth, or achieving a purpose is reaching a destination, and so on. There are hundreds of these that you learn just by living in the world unconsciously because you have a brain, right? Because neurons happen to work that way. Now, what does this have to do with politics and morality? The answer is everything. What is your first experience with governance? In your family.
Go to bed.
Go to bed. Eat your dinner. Yeah. Here's your bottle. Don't throw it on the floor. Okay. Now, you learn governance in your family. Now, you experience the members of your family, and you experience being told what to do. And they're in different parts of your brain. And you get a metaphor that a governing institution is a family. And it can apply to the church, where you have the Holy Father. It can apply to businesses, little league teams, all kinds of governing institutions, and to nations. Now, when it applies to nations, it's kind of interesting. So, by the time you're 7 years old, you have learned that George Washington was the father of his country. And you didn't confuse him with Daddy. Right? You learned the metaphor. No problem. You learned it automatically. And not only here, but in Mother Russia, Mother India, and the fatherland. Right? It is around the world. It is a natural metaphor you learn just by living in your family. Okay? And you can't avoid it. It's there. Now, what about morality? How do you learn morality? Well, what is morality? Morality is about a couple of things. Morality is about well-being and ill-being. That is, the question of morality is, are you helping or hurting people? And are you taking care of yourself? Those are issues that have to do with morality. Now, so, let's take an example. First of all, where do you experience well-being in your brain? In that nice positive emotional pathway. That's where you experience things like satisfaction. Where do you experience ill-being? In that other emotional pathway, where you experience things like annoyance and and anger and so on. Now, what correlates with that? Right? Here's an example. Suppose you're eating pure food. Satisfaction. Suppose you're eating rotten food. Yuck. Right? That is, you're better off if you're eating pure food than if you're eating rotten food. So you get a metaphor that morality is purity and immorality is rottenness. That was a rotten, low-down thing to do. Right? Now, and there are purification rituals around the world. Okay? Now, and not only that, it's been found out that people who have done something that's wrong tend to wash their hands more and longer than other people. The study was actually done both Ohio State and here. Now, there are other cases. You're better off, ask any one-year-old, you're better off if you can stand erect than if you have to crawl on the ground. Right? So morality is uprightness. And immorality is being a low-down snake, underhanded, and so on. You're better off if you have all the things you need, right, than if you don't. So well-being is seen as a kind of sense of wealth. And therefore, if I do something to you, I do a favor, and I've increased your well-being, you say, how can I ever repay you? I'm in your debt. I owe you one. Okay? Now, this is called moral accounting. And it's a very interesting thing. Suppose I do something to harm you. Then you can pay me back by harming me back. Or you can suppose I do something to harm you, I can make up for it by restitution, by doing something good for you. Or you can take revenge by taking something good away from me. Or you could forgive the debt, forgive us our debts, etc. Right? That is, moral accounting is one of the major moral systems of the world. And it comes out of the idea that well-being is wealth, having the things you need. Now, other cases. You're better off, look, every kid is better off if they're cute and cuddly than if they're really ugly. And you get a metaphor that morality is beauty and immorality is ugliness. So you get, that was a beautiful thing to do, and it's getting ugly around here. Okay? Right. I could go on. There are dozens of these, and they go around the world, and you learn them simply by functioning every day in your life with a brain. So basically we have those, and there are a couple of others that are very important. You're better off, in general, if you're a kid, if you listen to your parents than if you don't, assuming that your parents are there to take care of you. therefore you learn a metaphor that morality is obedience. You are better off if your parents take care of you and nurture you than if they don't. So you learn a metaphor that morality is nurturance. Those two metaphors are very important in our moral and political life in this country, because they combine with the metaphor by neural binding, remember good old neural binding, with the metaphor that a governing institution is a family. And we have strict father families in which morality is obedience, and nurturant parent families in which morality is nurturance. And those families project onto governing institutions of various kinds, like the church, like the nation, like the market, and so on. And let's go through that and see how that works. So, I wrote a book about, 12 years ago, called Moral Politics, in which I asked the question, why is it that the same people who are against abortion are for the flat tax? And why are the same people for the flat tax against environmental regulations? And why are those people in favor of owning machine guns? And why are those people for tort reform? And then I said, well, I was puzzled. There are these conservatives. That's what it said in the contract with America. I didn't understand it. So I said, look, I have the opposite views on all of these. How do my views fit together if I can't figure out theirs? And I couldn't figure out mine at all. Now, this was embarrassing for a professor of semantics here. But I did realize this was a problem in cognitive science. Right? It's in my field. How do ideas fit together? That's a problem in my field. So I said, okay, let's start doing some research. And then I remembered that we had this metaphor of the nation as family. And so what I did was I took the conservative views and the progressive views, and I mapped out the metaphor, which you can do. You can mathematically just map it out. And I said, okay, if this is the output, what's the input? And what you got for conservative reasoning was a strict father family, where morality is obedience, and for liberal reasoning, a nurturant parent family, where morality is nurturance. Now, here's how they work. And in fact, shortly after I did that, I gave a talk at a cognitive linguistics conference. 500 cognitive linguists, even more than are in this room. Huge numbers of them. And up at the corner, this was in Albuquerque, up in the corner were two linguists from the Christian Coalition, who, they were Bible translators. They're very good linguists, and they were friends. And they were sitting there whispering through my whole talk. You know what it's like, these guys in the back row. Now, so I'm watching them whispering, and I'm giving this talk. And at the end of the talk, we go have a party. So I'm out drinking some beer. They're not. And they come up to me and they say, hey, about this strict father family, you pretty much got it right. You got to fix it here. It's not quite right there, but it's close. Good work, fine. By the way, you should know all this. Don't you read Dobson? So I said, who? This was 1995. I didn't know who James Dobson was. They said, James Dobson. Who? Okay. Well, he's on he's from Focus on the Family. He's on more radio stations than anyone in America. He has his columns in more newspapers than anyone in America. He has so many employees, and he's so many people write to his organization that he needs his own zip code. He employs so many people, he has his own freeway exit in Colorado Springs. I said, He said, surely you have seen his classic Dare to Discipline. I said, well, not in Codys. I had been in the child rearing section of Codys buying books sometime just before that for people who had children. And I had always gone down to Codys to get those books and knew of everything there. No Dare to Discipline. But not in Codys. He said, come on. This was when it was in Telegraph. You wouldn't find it in Codys. You got to go to your local Christian bookstore. I said, well, I live in Berkeley. They said, even in Berkeley. Go down past Codys, down Telegraph, look to the right, you will find the Jews for Jesus bookstore. So when I got back from Albuquerque, I put on my dark glasses and literally walked down Telegraph, went into the Jews for Jesus bookstore. There on the back shelf were a bunch of the new Dare to Discipline and other childering books. And I got a plain brown wrapper and I loaded up and came back and read it. And there's a whole chapter in Moral Politics saying what's in there. But basically, the short story goes like this. This is what is taught. That in a strict father family, you have two parents of opposite gender, mommy and daddy. Now, daddy's the leader. And he knows right from wrong, and he knows what to do. He's also, you need him because he protects the family. And mommy can't do that. You need him because he wins those competitions in the world and he supports the family, and mommy can't do that. And kids are born bad in the sense that they just do what they want to do. You know, they don't know right from wrong. And they need a strict father to teach them right from wrong because mommy's not strict enough. So you need a strict father in the following way. Whenever they do wrong, he's got to punish them. And it's his duty. Because the only way they will become moral beings is if they're punished painfully enough so that they will avoid doing wrong and get the discipline to do what's right. And it turns out Dobson is very clear in Dare to Discipline. He says you absolutely must punish painfully enough. Not necessarily too painfully, but painfully enough so that they will avoid it. Now, he then is very clear. He's sort of a liberal. And what he says is this, there is absolutely no reason to punish a child below the age of 15 months. You know? The other books say from birth, and he says they're wrong, that's cruel, kids don't know before they're 15 months. Now, this is real. And he says something further, that if they got this discipline, then in the free market, they can go out and use that discipline to become prosperous. Now, what if they're not prosperous? That means they're not disciplined enough. If they're not disciplined, they can't be moral, and so they deserve their poverty. What does that say about social programs? Dobson is clear. Social programs take away your incentive to be disciplined because they give people things they haven't earned. And if you don't have your incentive to be disciplined, you won't be disciplined. Therefore, you cannot be moral. And so social programs both lead to people not being able to earn a living and not to live a moral life. So they themselves are immoral. Okay? The logic. Straightforward. You take this, you apply it via the idea that a governing institution is a family, and you get a whole bunch of conservative political views. Right out of it, straight out of strict father logic. Moreover, the strict father is the decider in the family. It's the strict father that makes the decisions. And that's why there are so many conservative fatherhood movements where they say, if you have deserted your family, go back and become the leader and tell them what to do. Because they need a father to tell them what to do. Right? And this is serious. You have lots and lots of conservative fatherhood movements based on this idea. But the general point is that these views as a logic of a strict father family that gets applied metaphorically in other areas. For example, take religion. What is the view of God? The view of God there is, God's a strict father. He says, here are my commandments. You follow them, you go to heaven. You don't, you go to hell. Well, I'll give you a second chance. Now you follow them, you go to heaven. If not, you go to hell. Okay, very clear. A strict father, God. Notice this is different from God as a nurturing parent who says, turn the other cheek. Look after the poor. Heal the sick. be a good steward of nature, of the environment. Okay? Totally different views of God in fundamentalist and progressive religion, in Christianity. You also get certain views, different views in Judaism and so on. Now, what about the market? You get different views of the market. So let me first tell you about the nurturing parent family, which is simple. It says you got two parents who are equal. Their job is to nurture their parents, their children, and to raise their children to be nurturers of others. Government, and it says that a nation that is a progressive nation has to have citizens who are there to take care of each other. And they do this through the government, and the government has two moral missions: protection and empowerment. What's protection? Very simple. Protection is not just military and police protection, it's environmental protection, it's worker protection, consumer protection, safety nets, health care. What is empowerment? Well, it's not just building roads and communication systems, but also empowerment is having an educational system. Empowerment is having a banking system so that you can get bank loans and keep your money safe. It's having a stock market that run by the SEC. It's having a court system mostly for corporate law, but also for criminal law. Now, turns out if you're in business, you can't make a dime without the government system of protection and empowerment. So what are taxes? Taxes, under this view, is what you pay to live in America, where you have protection and empowerment, instead of, say, a third world country where you don't have it. Instead of, say, living in Chad or Bangladesh or someplace where you don't have all these things. Okay? That is something every progressive understands when you say it, but how often have you heard it said? Nobody comes out and says it because we don't have it out there yet in public. Now, notice the difference in these two family structures when the metaphors apply them to the market. The market is a governing institution. Okay? Now, have you ever heard the expression, let the market decide? We have a general metaphor that institutions are persons. And in fact, in law, corporations are persons. It's in fact legal. The metaphor is made true legally. Now, when you have that, you understand the market, if you're a conservative, as being a kind of strict father. It rewards discipline and punishes lack of it, fiscal discipline. And it's the decider. And that's natural and it's moral, because the idea is that if you're fiscally disciplined, then you should make money, and if you're not, you shouldn't. Okay? That's the idea. And nobody should control the strict father. There's nobody higher, because he knows right from wrong. So what that says is there should be nothing higher governing the free market. Well, what governs the free market? What are they against? What are conservatives against? Four things that are higher: government regulation, taxation, right, which takes away profits, unions and worker rights, and tort cases, where people can sue companies that have harmed the public, and therefore they lose money. Those are the four things where there is a force above the market that is seen as illegitimate to conservatives. But to progressives, those are seen as natural and normal. That is, the idea of the market is to help people. That's why you have a market in prescription drugs, not a market in hallucinatory drugs or other kinds of drugs, and so on. And the markets are constructed; they're not natural, and they're constructed by regulation. And the regulations are there for protection, which is a moral mission of government. And you have things like tort cases, which are part of protection. They say if you're a corporation, you're harming people, it's going to cost you. And you'll have an incentive not to harm people in the future. So in short, you have two utterly different notions of the market projected from these two notions of the family. And you have different notions about how government itself should be run, and how foreign policy should be run, and so on. Right? In short, the fact that we have metaphors that are unconscious, that we don't know are there, that are developed in childhood around the world and so on, and then come together in a culture to give certain combinations of those, sets up our political life, and it's largely unconscious. This is not discussed in the media. You don't have a discussion like this on CNN or Fox or, or NBC. It's just not there. This is part of the cognitive unconscious. Now, what about that last part that I talked about in terms of enlightenment reason, which is self-interest? The assumption there was that we evolved to have reason to serve our self-interest. And it turns out that too is overdone. There was an amazing experiment done in Parma, Italy in 1996. It was done in the lab of Professor Rizzolatti. And I've visited the lab and I've worked with people who are from that lab. What they did was this. They were studying the macaque monkey. And they were studying what was going on in the brain of the monkey when the monkey performed actions like peeling a banana or pressing a bar or grabbing a ring or picking up an object. They trained the monkey to do these things, and they had very sophisticated probes that went into the monkey's brain, in particular in what is called the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex choreographs complex action. And then it has connections to the motor cortex up here, which controls simple action. A simple action is something like this. Open, close your elbow, raise your shoulder, things like that. If I want to take a drink of water, I have to choreograph all those simple actions up here, over there. Okay? Now, so they had this set up so that every time the monkey performed a complicated action, they could see exactly what neurons were firing, how much. And this would be registered on the computer. And to make sure the computer was working, they had it make a sound so the experimenter could tell. It went click, 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 click. Okay, now, the experimenter's doing this experiment. It's going great. And this is Italy. He takes a nice lunch. And he comes back, didn't have dessert. There's a pile of bananas. He picks up a banana, starts to peel it, and he hears click, 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 click. Wait a minute, it's connected to the monkey, not me. Turns out those neurons in the premotor cortex fire when either the monkey performs an action or sees someone else performing the same one. And this is not a miracle. They subsequently found out why, which is, and it's true of us as much as the monkeys, the reason why is that we are born with certain neural fibers that connect the premotor cortex to the parietal cortex just behind it. And the parietal cortex integrates vision, visual information, sound information, etc. from various parts of the body. And those neurons there are connected to the ones in the premotor cortex, and as you develop, they're tuned so that they would go together. So if you see yourself doing something, or you're imitating your parents, or your parents are imitating you, what you learn is that these things should be firing together. Now, what is remarkable about this is that those neurons, that what are called mirror neurons, those neurons where you can look at somebody and tell that what they're doing, your own body neurons that govern your bodily movements will be firing as well. They're connected to the emotional pathways, which is why when you see somebody happy and smiling, you can understand that they're happy. Because you see their physiology, you know what those muscles would be like in you, that's connected to your emotional regions, and you can feel their happiness. If you see them writhing in pain, you can feel their pain. We have a physiological basis for empathy. We are born, hardwired to be capable of empathy. Now, because between 0 and 5, half of the neural connections may die, you have to have that reinforced throughout your childhood if you're going to grow up to be an empathetic being. And if you don't experience empathy, they start to go. Now, that is one of the reasons why the way that you're raised matters. Okay, now that empathy comes into progressive thought. It is the basis of what it means to be a progressive. You care about people and you act responsibly on that care. That is the basis of all progressive thought. Now, how does all of this stuff actually show up in political campaigns? Right? We've just been through an amazing campaign season. And a number of things have shown up there. But before we do that, I want to go back to just review a little bit. We started out with Enlightenment reason, which we all grew up with, and many of us believe, which is that all thought is conscious, abstract, dispassionate, fitting the world directly, that it's logical, that we all think exactly the same way, and that it's for self-interest alone. Absolutely false, as we've just seen. All right, if you believe that, what would it mean for me to write a book about framing? It would mean that that book was trying to manipulate people, because it says that you should be framing things in the way you believe it. That is, Democrats have not been doing that well. And so you'll think that since reason can fit the world directly, you shouldn't have to frame anything. That framing just distorts the way reason fits the world. That framing could only be spin. And that framing was kind of spin and PR to manipulate people. Not true. Framing is the most natural thing you do. You know, there's a frame for a glass or a hospital or a doctor or anything else. But framing can be used fraudulently by frauds and can be used honestly by honest people. And what I've been saying is that you should be effective in expressing what you believe. That you should not be using it fraudulently, because you'll get caught anyway. But the point is that you shouldn't be doing that. That that's not a moral thing to do. But if you have a moral vision, then, and it requires framing, you should do it. Secondly, if you believe Enlightenment reason, you will think not only that reason can fit the world directly, but that it will be logical, and that you will reason to that anybody. All you have to do is tell people the facts, and they'll reason to the right conclusion. And you get progressives doing this over and over again. You know, they got the facts wrong. Everybody should reason to the right conclusion, not to vote for this guy. Doesn't happen. Right? It's ineffective. Not that it's wrong. The facts do matter. That's not saying facts don't matter. It's saying the facts unframed will not make people lead to the right conclusion. Okay? That's totally opposite from saying we should ignore facts. It says we should know the facts and frame them more in terms of their moral content, so that people can see why these facts are important and why they're important for what is right versus what is wrong. Now, that's a totally different idea, but that's what this is about. Now, it turns out that this view, Enlightenment reason, is taught. Where is it taught? Well, let's start with schools of journalism, like the one over here. In journalism school, you're taught to be objective, just the facts. Get out the facts. You know, who, what, when, where. Make sure you get it right. Get it down. And what follows from that is that the language is neutral. Well, you want to be careful about the language in that they express the facts, but that if it turns out that conservatives have gotten their language for their frames out there in public, and that's the normal way people think, then journalists can just use it. Like the New York Times using tax relief on its front page. Right? Just use it. War on terror, no problem. Use it. Now, this is very important because all journalists are taught that. Occasionally, I'm invited to talk to first-year journalism grad students. And I give them a talk like this, and inevitably, after 10 or 15 minutes, somebody raises his hand and says, "That's the opposite of everything we're learning." And I say, "That's true." He said, "Well, what are we supposed to do about it?" I said, "You got a problem." But here's the problem. We have no journalistic genre for talking about the framing of issues. There is no normal way. There are news stories, there are sports pages, editorial pages, columns, movie reviews, but no genre for talking about political framing. Nothing, not there. It's not something that you see on TV regularly. It's not here because the idea isn't out there in public. People are still thinking in terms of Enlightenment reason, and journalists are taught that way. So even students of journalism who would like to do something more have a problem. Then there are other problems. Look at democratic policy shops. They all use Enlightenment reason. And it's part of what is called the rational actor model. Now, where is the rational actor model taught? In graduate school at Berkeley. And undergraduate courses. In the political science department, in the business school, in the economics department, and so on. And it uses Enlightenment reason. Now, it's not the only thing taught. Some years back, in the 70s and 80s, I had a colleague here named Danny Kahneman, who then went on to Princeton. But while he was here, he invented behavioral economics. That is, he showed that people making economic decisions actually use frames and metaphors and narratives, not just Enlightenment reason. And since then, that has become a very important part of the teaching of economics and business and so on. But the dominant view is still the rational actor model, and it's also applied in foreign policy. So that is one piece of this. What you have is reinforcement of the old false view of reason in universities, in the media, in journalism school, and so on. And politicians, even if they knew and had time to read, political leaders don't have time to read. Maybe on the flights across country sometimes, but normally they don't have much time. Have you ever seen the schedule of a senator? I mean, it's unbelievable. They're just going from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed every day. It's incredible. They don't have time to sit down and read and think these things through. And so where they depend upon the policy shops, they depend upon the journalists and the media and the pollsters. And the pollsters also use Enlightenment reason. How? What is a poll? A poll assumes reasoning is conscious. They assume that you are voting for people on the basis of your self-interest. So they ask you, what are the most important issues for you? Give me the 6 most, and you get those. And they don't talk about all kinds of other things that could be very important. So that is part of what you actually see. Now, where has this mattered in this campaign? Turns out to matter everywhere. Let me begin. I want to talk a little bit about Barack Obama versus Hillary. But to understand that, you've got to go back to Ronald Reagan. Believe it or not. I always wondered why Reagan won. I don't know if you did, but I wondered why Reagan won. I was always surprised when he got all those votes. And I watched those debates between Reagan and Carter and Mondale. I thought Carter and Mondale mopped the floor with him on the issues. And then Reagan turned out to win, and I didn't get it. But a few years ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to talk to Reagan's chief strategist, a fine gentleman named Richard Wirthlin, who's now retired. Very smart, very interesting guy, very courtly. I took him out to lunch, and I asked him, what was it like to be Reagan's chief strategist? And he told me this story. He said, I was trained in Berkeley. And I learned to be a pollster that people voted for candidates on the basis of their positions on issues, and that's how I did my polls. So he said, look, I went out and I did my first poll for Reagan and found out nobody liked his positions on issues, and they all wanted to vote for Reagan. And I had no idea why anybody wanted to vote for my candidate. This is embarrassing for a chief strategist. So he said, I got to put together focus groups and surveys and so on, try to figure this out. And he finally figured it out. He said, people vote on 5 things. First, values. Reagan talked about values, not just about issues. Issues were examples of values. So first, values. Second, he was a great communicator. He connected with people, and people cared whether politicians connected with them and communicated with them. Third, people assumed that he said what he believed. And Wirthlin, in fact, claimed that Reagan said what he believed. I mean, I may disagree with that, but, you know, that's okay. But he's right. People did assume that Reagan said what he believed, that he was authentic. Next, they felt they could trust him because he said what he believed and he communicated with them and you knew his values. You might disagree with his values, but you knew where he stood. You knew what to expect. So you could trust what he was going to do. And last, they identified with him because he communicated and connected with them. Okay? So they ran the campaign on those 5 things: values, authenticity, communication, trust, and identity. And in those debates, that's what the debates were really about, not the issues. That's why Reagan won them. That's what George Bush ran on, where Kerry and Gore ran on positions on issues. In this campaign, in the Democratic primary, who ran on positions on issues? Hillary. Who ran on trust, etc.? Barack. Now, Hillary switched in the Pennsylvania primary and started running the other way, but it was a little late. But the point, it's not the only reason that Barack won, but it's part of it. And it's something that you felt as you were watching this campaign. There was something very different about these candidates. And Hillary's people were mad. And let me tell you why they were mad. They actually, mostly, they're theorists. People like Bill Galston and Elaine K. Mark. Unless you're really into politics, you don't know who the DLC theorists are. But they're Bill Galston and Elaine K. Mark are among them. They had written about this Reagan strategy. And what they said was Reagan won on the basis of, quote, personality. And that this was illegitimate. That a rational campaign should be run on the issues. That's what campaigns should really be about. Now, first of all, was it really irrational of people to want to know what their president's values were? I mean, think for a minute, right? You're electing somebody, they come out with a bunch of positions on issues, and 2 years later, you don't know what the issues are going to be. You know, what do you really care about when you're electing a president or anybody else to office? You care about their values. You care about whether they're going to tell you the truth. You care about whether they're going to be able to communicate that to you. You care about whether you can trust them. And you care about whether you identify with them, whether they're really representing you. That is not insane or personality, it's sanity. But it's based not on Enlightenment reason, but on real reason. What I've described to you is the way people really reason. Enlightenment reason has been called the defining of rationality. It has been said that that defines what it means to be rational, and it's false. To be rational is to use real reason the way people really reason. And those voters are rational in that sense. They're sane. Now, let's go on a little bit about this election. What is the central idea of Barack Obama's campaign? The one they claim that's shouted out loud is change, hope, okay? Those are the secondary concepts. The central concept is empathy. Now, you haven't heard this discussed much on the networks, but Barack Obama discusses it. And when he discusses it, nobody ever asks him a question about it. For example, in the Selma speech, you go and read, go online, look up these speeches yourself. In the Selma speech, over and over, he talks about the empathy deficit, that this country does not care enough, that the government does not care about the people, that you need a government that cares about people. Okay? Over and over. In the Philadelphia speech on race, he called it a more perfect union. He said we need more freedom, more fairness, more caring, more opportunity. Quote, more caring right after freedom and fairness. A day later, he is interviewed by Anderson Cooper on 360 on CNN, and Cooper asks him, "What is your view of patriotism?" And he says, "Patriotism begins with people caring about each other. That's why we have the values of freedom and fairness." Cooper never asked the follow-up question. A week later, Ann Curry on Morning Show on NBC asks an Ann Curry-like question. She says, "What is the most important thing your mother taught you?" And Obama, without half a second going by, says, "Empathy." That, putting yourself in other people's shoes is the basis of human kindness. That's what leadership requires. Ever heard it discussed? No discussion, whatever. Now, you might think, well, it's just hidden in a speech and so on, but it's actually in the policy journals. How many of you read the American Prospect? We have 1, 2, 3. All right, so 3 out of the 47. Now, there's a marvelous piece in the American Prospect about a month ago called The Obama Doctrine. Very excellent survey of his foreign policy. And it talked about the difference between his foreign policy and the previous realist notion of foreign policy. The previous notion is at the level of the state. That's why they call it the State Department. And the idea there is that every nation seeks to maximize its national interest, which is 3 things: military strength, economic health measured by the GDP, and political influence. That's the national interest. And this is pursued, assumed to be pursued by every state to maximize that, and that's seen as a good thing. It's sort of like economic theory. If everybody seeks their own profit, the profit of all will be maximized. So if every nation seeks to maximize their national interest, that's how they'll all do best in maximizing their national interest. Now, false, but that's the theory. Now, into this, and of course, how do you maximize your national interest? You use the military, you use trade pacts for the economy, and you use your political influence. That's what realist foreign policy is about, at the level of the state. Obama comes along and he said, most of the problems in the world are not at the level of the state. They're at the level of the person. Hunger, poverty, the need for clean water, public health issues around the world, things like women's rights, children's rights, labor rights, ecological issues around the world, global ecology, and terrorism is not at the level of the state. Refugee problems. Says these are the biggest problems we have. They are the really serious ones, and we need a foreign policy to deal with those. It's called the Foreign Policy of Human Dignity. That's what that article is about. Now, again, it's actually written in the policy journals, nothing on the TV or the radio. No discussion, no questions, and so on. But there it is. It's empathy at the heart of foreign policy. Now, Obama makes a very interesting conceptual move, which I think is correct. When I wrote Moral Politics, I said, look, you have a strict father model, a nurturing parent model. That's what you have for conservative politics and progressive politics. And I also pointed out and go over in this book something very important, which is everybody actually has both models. We all know both the strict and nurturant models in our brain. We have them there. But you might be completely nurturant in your active life, at home and in your politics. You walk into an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie and understand it. You've got a strict father model. You don't walk out saying, what was that about? Now, it turns out there's a reason why you have these 2 conflicting models. They contradict each other in a single brain. And it's a basic property about brains. It's called mutual inhibition. It's very common throughout the brain to have 2 systems that are incompatible with each other, where the activation of one inhibits the activation of the other, and vice versa. Okay? And what we have is we have learned both strict and nurturant models with mutual inhibition, but each of them applies to different areas. Could be just be understanding movies. Or it could be the case that some people are conservative about some things and progressive about others. There are people who are conservative about foreign policy and progressive about domestic policy, or conservative about fiscal policy and progressive about social policy, and on, all kinds of combinations. For example, compare Chuck Hagel and Joe Lieberman. Now, Chuck Hagel is a conservative who happens to be against the war. Lieberman is largely liberal, but he is for the war. Okay? They have nothing in common. They're both called moderates. There is no ideology of the moderate. What is called a moderate is somebody who has some of one and some another, but you don't know which mix. What does that mean politically? It turns out to matter. We have a metaphor that is false. It's a metaphor of the political line from left to right, with the center. And there's supposed to be an ideology of the center. And politicians are told that they should move to the center if they're told only if they're liberals, not if they're conservatives, that they should move from left to right to get more votes. The conservatives don't say move from right to left to get more votes. But, so these guys say move from left to right, you get more votes because you get all the other votes too, assuming that they're lined up left to right. But they're not lined up left to right. What happens actually is that a centrist is a politician who is either biconceptual in certain ways, and there are such folks. We have lots of Democrats who are actually biconceptual. They are progressive in some areas, but genuinely conservative in others. Or they're people who give up their progressive views in order to compromise for some political reason and adopt a conservative view against their own moral principles. And that happens. People move move to the right. Now, it turns out that Hillary and Barack both talk about bipartisanship. But what is bipartisanship? They don't mean exactly the same things. Hillary, by bipartisanship, means move to the right, adopt a conservative view. So you can talk to conservatives by agreeing with them on their moral principles, even if you don't really agree with them. But for the sake of some legislation, you might have to. Barack says the opposite. He says there are lots of people who are conservatives, but have some, or biconceptual, that is, they have some progressive views. And there's a systematicity. Lots of conservatives believe that they should be good stewards of the land. They love the land. Lots of conservatives are honest business people. That is, they would never harm their employees, they would never harm the public, they run an honest business. That's a progressive business person, and so on. So bipartisanship for Barack means finding people who see themselves as conservative but already agree with you on many progressive issues and work with them on it. That's why he has a thing called Project Joshua. Have you heard about this? This is to go out into the evangelical community. And he has found out, as many of us knew in advance, that the evangelical community is split. Not all evangelicals are fundamentalists by any means. There are lots of evangelicals who are biconceptual and who really believe that you should turn the other cheek, that you should help the poor, that you should heal the sick, and that you should be good stewards of the land. And Obama went to the largest megachurch in America, Rick Warren's megachurch, and he talked about that. He talked about where he agreed with him, not where he disagreed with them. He disagreed on all kinds of issues. He talked about just where he agreed with them and got a standing ovation. And he started this thing called Project Joshua to organize those evangelicals. Now he's being sued. It turns out there's an evangelical fundamentalist who has a thing called the Joshua Project. And he says that Barack has stolen the name, right? So he's suing. And this is a very fortunate suit. Because first of all, it's going to lose, but in addition to that, it will popularize. This guy doesn't understand framing. Now, so there's another, I want to finish up with one more thing that you may not realize about Obama. Whereas I talked about strict and nurturant models as being progressive, conservative and progressive, he doesn't. You've never heard Obama call himself either a progressive or a liberal. And there's a deep reason for this. And it's in this discussion of patriotism. He believes, and I think he's right, that this country was founded on empathy, on caring about people. And there's a study, a very interesting book by Lynn Hunt, a marvelous historian at UCLA, called Inventing Human Rights. Lynn Hunt looked at the Declaration of Independence, and she saw something quite interesting about that. It said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, ... And she said, when did they become self-evident? I'm a historian, let's find out. She was a historian of that period in England, France, and America. So she said, okay, it's supposed to be that we got human rights from the Enlightenment over in the 1600s. Did we? Well, she's a historian, let's look at the documents. Sorry, not self-evident in the 1600s. Up to 1700, nothing. Well, what about 1700 to 1725? Nope, not self-evident, not out there in the documents. Well, what about 1750? It starts to become self-evident. How? It becomes self-evident because there are novels written and plays written and paintings made and drawings made of the sufferings of ordinary poor people at the hands of powerful people. And those arouse empathy. And through the arousal of empathy, you get the idea that poor people are human beings too, and that they should be accorded rights like freedom and fairness and equality. And it becomes self-evident by 1776. From 1750 to 1776, it changed. And she concludes that, in fact, this country was based on the idea of empathy, that's where those ideas come from. And that's exactly what Obama says in The Audacity of Hope, if you bought your copy. Now, Obama is a far more interesting political leader than you might give him credit for if you listen to the TV. Because most of the most interesting stuff is not discussed. But I recommend strongly that you actually buy a copy of The Audacity of Hope and read it carefully. When I did it in my seminar, we took the first 3 hours to go through 8 pages. It's very deep, it's very complicated. This is not the case this is not a simple-minded person. Now, the folks in the Hillary campaign did not understand why people were voting for Obama, because he wasn't giving all the lists of policies. And they said, well, he was just using empty rhetoric. But it's not. If you actually read what he says, it's anything but empty rhetoric. It's actually deep and fairly interesting. Very interesting. And very different. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. In this campaign, what you're going to see between Obama and McCain is a lot of attacks, not necessarily coming from each other, but coming from the outside. You're going to see the 527s piling on. And you've already seen it. I mean, day before yesterday, it was Fox News with the clip of Michelle Obama as, Obama's baby mama. Where baby mama is a term for someone who's had a child out of wedlock. Yep. Fox News, directly. You're going to see lots of this stuff. But the question is exactly what determines the attacks. Racism can determine the attacks, but there are other things. And let's talk both about the attacks on Obama and the attacks that are going to come on McCain. First, Obama. Notice they are both running on the Reagan list of values, of trust, of being straightforward, telling the truth, authenticity. So Obama is being attacked on his values. Is he patriotic? He's being attacked on the question of authenticity. Is he really telling you the truth? Why did he stay in that church for so long? Can we trust him if his pastor had these wild beliefs? Now, let me say one thing about the word pastor. When did you start hearing the word pastor a lot? Did you hear it a lot before 3 months ago? I mean, it turns out every attack on Obama for that uses the word pastor. Why that word? It turns out to be a metaphoric word. It's based on the idea of a shepherd and sheep. That is, the minister is the shepherd, these are his flock, and they follow him. They do believe what he believes. If that logic were not there would be no reason to say that Obama had any beliefs of the pastor. Right? It's the word that is required to get you that logic. And notice that if it were just his physical trainer, no one would care. Now, so you begin to see the attacks are attacks on the fact that he can communicate well. So it's empty rhetoric. In short, the things he's running on determine where the attacks are going to come from. And the same thing is true of McCain. McCain is running a race on character. And in fact, I was on the same program with the guy who for a while was McCain's media strategist up to the end of the nomination campaign. And he said, we're going to run it on character. And they did. And it's being run on the following ideas. McCain's a war hero. In particular, he has the following character. He is loyal, strong, and courageous. Okay, first three things. Then, he's a straight talker. He tells the truth. You can believe him. He's a maverick. He doesn't believe just what anyone else says. He has his own views, and so on. Those are the main strong things. And he's a leader. He's in the military. Because of his military background and experience, he has the ability to be commander-in-chief. Okay? That's what he's running on. Then there are the issues, and they discuss the issues all the time. But what are the attacks going to be? And they've already started on McCain. For example, is he a straight talker? Well, go to your Google, put in the real McCain. You will get brave new films. Robert Greenwald has got lots and lots of clips of McCain saying one thing and then the opposite thing for the sake of political convenience, over and over and over. So that's one thing, and those films will be shown again and again as the campaign goes on. There's a book that's come out, and I can't remember the name, on McCain's military experience in Vietnam, claiming that what he actually did there in sort of giving in to his captors was commit treason. I don't vouch for this book, I'm just saying it's there, it's out there. There's another thing that's being done. They've checked out, of course, McCain's voting record, and it turns out overwhelmingly he voted with Bush. He's not a maverick. And that will come up again and again. You've already seen this in the third Bush term and all of that. That's another point of attack. He's not really a maverick. And then there's an interesting one that is just beginning to show. And again, it's not something I can vouch for, but I can tell you what's going to be coming. McCain has argued that on the basis of his experience, he deserves to be commander-in-chief, and he's ready to do that. And the question is, who has he ever commanded? And it appears, nobody. And after Vietnam, he got out, and he was not given a command. I mean, it's sort of strange. You would expect that, under those circumstances, a war hero would be raised in position and given a command. And so far as we can tell, We can't find anybody he ever commanded. Now, people will ask this, maybe there were some, and the question will be asked. But then another question will be asked, if not, why not? And the scuttlebutt is that he was judged unstable and unsuitable for command. We don't know this, but there's only one way to find out. Look at the military record. So people will be demanding to see the military record. But notice what is going on in all of these cases, in both sides. They're running on the Reagan 5 principles, and the attacks are based on those principles. And that's what you can see in the campaign. That's the structure of it. And it'll show up over and over. So, it turns out that it matters how the brain works. It turns out that if you're going to understand any of this stuff, you need to understand that Enlightenment reason doesn't work, that there is real reason, real rationality, and that we need to be talking about it overtly if we're going to understand our politics. And that's why I wrote the book. Thank you. Questions, please. Yes.
Mindful of your comment that words are not frames, I noted that you, as the antonym to conservative, you used progressive at least 8 times as often as the 3 occasions you used liberal. How do we unbundle both the left and the right are against the word liberal? I came of age with progressive Henry Wallace, liberal Hubert Humphrey, liberal Adlai Stevenson, etc.
Okay, very good question. Why not the word liberal? 2 things to say. The question is, why did I use the word progressive and not liberal? I rarely use the word liberal. Okay? Very, very, very good question. First of all, before John Podesta chose a name for the Center for American Progress, he did a poll. And it turned out that 25% of the people liked the word liberal and 82% liked the word progressive. So the word progressive started to be used. But there was a reason why the word liberal became unpopular. First, on the left, it became unpopular during the Vietnam War because of the Cold War liberals. It also became unpopular more recently in globalization because of neoliberal economics. But on the right, there was a strict campaign. And it's a campaign that created conservative populism. It started in the 60s, and it noticed a couple of things. This was done first by Nixon operatives and then other conservative operatives. They noticed social issues nonstop in those communities over and over and over to activate their conservative way of thinking in their brains. They didn't think this way, by the way, about neuroscience. They thought about marketing. They came from a marketing background. But at the same time, they had to create the liberal elite. This was an overt creation. The idea that there was a liberal elite, a liberal media, tax and spend liberals, limousine liberals, Hollywood liberals, Birkenstock wearing, sushi eating, latte drinking, I'm sorry I didn't get my latte yet, liberals. And the idea was they were looking down on ordinary working people. And what that did was inhibit ordinary working people's progressive views, or liberal views, and activate their conservative views. And they created successfully a conservative populism. And that populism is not based on economics. That's why these folks vote against their economic interests. They're voting their identity, not their economic interests. And Obama made a mistake in San Francisco when he talked about these folks as clinging to their religion and so on. No, that's not what happened. What happened was a direct effect of a campaign of this sort. Now, and these folks are voting their identity, which is real. They really are biconceptual in this way. They really have some conservative views, not others. Now, this is again important for politics. Anyway, that's the answer. Yes?
If I take
if I take the conclusion that you've summarized here, you then would start with a point of view, a system of values, and then develop an inventory of metaphors, and frames, and metaphors, right? Or do I have that backwards?
You got it backwards. The metaphors and frames, to a large extent, come earlier. And they come out of these various family notions. So they're just there, and the question is that they're in the culture. What is your experience with them? And then, is there an experience with language that changes this? Now, what happened on the conservative side is a really interesting thing. Beginning in 1971, there was a document written by Lewis Powell called the Powell Memo, in which he argued that they had to start a think tank system because too many of the brightest young people in the country did not want to become conservative businessmen at the height of the Vietnam War. So they recommended getting conservatives to fund right-wing professorships and institutes, and then starting think tanks and funding them well, and then starting magazines and book publishing companies, and buying up media. And in addition to that, training institutes to train people how to talk in the right way. They train tens of thousands of conservatives. Getting volunteer conservative experts to appear in the media, setting up a booking agency, a business to book them all on TV and radio, which is why 80% of the talking heads on TV are conservatives. And they've gotten this out. And it turns out that the liberals have not done this. Why? Enlightenment reason. They learned this in college, and they thought that framing things and getting out a system like that was manipulation, when real reason, when being rational meant fitting the world, telling the truth, just getting the facts out there so people would reason to the right conclusion. And we don't need this, we just have to get the facts out there. And of course they did need it. They needed a way to express their values and tell the truth. Yes, Ed?
Yes, I'm doing some work on the failure of conservative values. And I'm wondering if you personally feel that the conservative values have failed, and if so, how have they failed?
There's not one answer, there are two, depending on how you frame it. So, if you frame it the way George Packer has in his New Yorker article, where he says conservative values have failed, what he really means is conservative ideology has run up against reality. It's not working in the real world. And that's true in lots of cases, even though conservatives have said, if we're in power, we create reality. And in many cases they've gotten the government breaking down, they've created all kinds of reality that we now have to face, huge debts and so on, right? It's not the case that was wrong. They in fact did create reality that way. But in the case of Iraq, Afghanistan, as we've heard today, in the case of our financial problems, they ran up against reality, and they don't have a way to actually deal with that. That's the way in which, quote, conservative values have failed in dealing with certain aspects of reality that are extremely important. However, they haven't failed in the sense that they're out there in our brains, that those values are there governing public discourse still, that McCain can run on all the same old slogans, you know, the tax and spend liberals, the defeatists, the we can't surrender, etc. All the same stuff is out there in our brains, available for elections. They have not failed in that way. So, yes and no.
We have time for one last question.
Just wondering, I've read some persuasion articles where they talk about a very successful technique is to introduce a third party to do the critiquing. Rather than one politician bouncing off another, you have the swift boat veteran kind of an attack. Is there an effective way to deal with that?
Well, first of all, it occurs on both the left and the right. You know, it's Robert Greenwald, not Obama, who's doing the real McCain commercials, you know, through private funding and through 527 funding. You know, you have Move On doing their commercials, and the idea that that McCain is another Bush. You have all kinds of things on both the left and the right. What has happened is this, that the attacks are coming from the 527s, which can spend as much money as they want, and then the candidates can look clean. That is, they can both look like they're above the fray and honorable and talk about and attack through the issues, and with the way they attack through the issues is using the framing system to attack exactly those 5 things again, but in terms of the issues. So that's the way this is working.
Both sides.
Okay. Yeah, both sides.
Thank you very much.
We're going to be signing books over here as long as, I'll be here as long as you are. And if you want to ask more questions, come on up and I'll sign them.